A few weeks ago, I was walking down the Erie Canal with my friend Jacqueline. Now, for me, she's my neighbor, but if you aren't cool enough to live where we live, you might know her as Jacqueline Malone, the host of the Go-To Gal podcast, which was listed by Forbes as one of the top 21 podcasts to know in 2021. Jacqueline has produced over 500 podcasts between Go-To Gal and the one that came before that with her business partner, All Up in Your Lady Business. And she and I were talking about all of the different things, all of the irons that we have in the fire. And she said, you know, Meg, I really just don't have time for SEO right now because I'm so busy with the podcast. And I was taken aback. I was like, you have 500 podcast episodes. That is your SEO. You don't have to choose between having a podcast and doing SEO. Just because you haven't blogged in a few years doesn't mean that you're not producing content that Google will love and that you can be found in through search engines on other platforms besides Google. So in this video, I'm going to dispel a couple myths about needing to choose between podcasting and SEO and help you understand how you can use SEO to get more subscribers to your podcast and how your podcast can help you show up in search results. So I'll do that right after this. Hi, my name is Meg Casebolt, and I'm the founder of Love at First Search, where we help online entrepreneurs to show up in search results and then turn those new visitors into leads, subscribers, and sales. Today, I'm going to be talking to all of you who either have podcasts or have been thinking about starting podcasts, and you want to be able to utilize search engine optimization as part of the promotion strategy for your podcast. Now, typically when I talk about SEO, I'm talking about getting found on Google because that's the biggest search engine in the world. That's sort of when we talk about SEO, often we're talking about Google. But podcasts are audio content. They can't necessarily be indexed by Google yet. They're working on it. They're going to start rolling out some of that technology. But Google is not the only search engine that can help you grow your podcast. There are a lot of audio search engines out there that you may not even think of as being search engines. Apple Podcasts, Google Play Store, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere that people can be listening to podcasts, they can be searching for podcasts. Those are search engines. And so there are specific ways that you can both help your podcast be found in those search engines and also ways that you can optimize your website so that your podcast can be found in those Google search results. So let's start by talking about how we can optimize the information that's going into your podcast RSS feed so that way you show up in those audio specific podcast search engines. One of the most important factors in the Apple Podcast algorithm is the title of your podcast itself, not the specific episodes, but the podcast title. So for my friend Jacqueline, I just told you that it was the Go-To Gal podcast, but if you go look her up in iTunes, it's actually listed as Go-To Gal with Jacqueline Malone, online marketing and mindset for female entrepreneurs. So she's able to get a lot of information into that podcast title. And I think actually the most important word that she has in that is marketing. She wants people to know that this is a digital marketing podcast or online marketing podcast. So she wants to get that in there. Now, that's how she's listed. You want to also be careful that you want to be clear about your title, but not trying to get too many keywords in there because Apple Podcasts has been known to crack down on people who are trying to get too many obvious keywords in there. So if you already have a podcast and it's not super clear what it's about, if you just have the title without a description, maybe you want to add a subtitle to it. If you're creating a new podcast from scratch, maybe you want to include one or two descriptive words in there of if people were looking for a podcast on this topic, this is what they would be looking for. Another way that you can show up in those audio search engines like Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify is to include specific keywords in your actual episode titles. So it doesn't have to be the all-encompassing keyword for everything that you could ever talk about in the podcast, but every single episode could show up for a specific topic. Here's an example. My friend Andrea has a podcast all about social media marketing, and recently she interviewed my client, Dr. Michelle Mazur, all about ethical marketing. And because Michelle was talking about ethical marketing, they want that episode to show up for the term ethical marketing, so they just called the episode title Ethical Marketing with Michelle Mazur. You don't need to be clever. You don't need to come up with something super clickbaity to get people to click through. through. Sometimes you just want to be clear about this is what you're going to get when you listen to this episode. And also, Google has recently started showing podcast recommendations of specific episodes in their Google search engine results. So when I go and search for the term podcasts about ethical marketing, this episode with Andrea and Michelle actually shows up right there on the search engine results page. So by including specific keywords in your podcast episode titles, you can have those specific episodes rank not only in the podcast search engines, but also right there in the Google search engine results page. I'll be talking in a future video all about keyword research for your podcast episode titles, and I'll link that up right here when it's ready. Now let's talk about how specific episodes can help you get found in search results on Google. I just mentioned how every episode could potentially have a keyword attached to it that could help you show up in those search engine results and get found for that particular episode. You can also create show notes for every episode that taps into that same or similar keywords, and you can optimize those show notes to include that keyword in specific places. These places are really similar to what I've said before about optimizing blog posts. So you could put those keywords into the link structure, so the permalink that comes after. If you just have 081, that can be easy for people to get to from listening to your podcast, but it might not be easy for Google to know, oh, that's for episode 81. So instead, you may want to include your keyword there and say /ethical-marketing, so that way Google knows this is the episode about ethical marketing. And the way that you can use that keyword to optimize your show notes is very similar to what you would do for a blog post in the places that you would place that specific keyword. So you can put it in the title of your post, in your subheadings, in your URL. If you have specific podcast art for that episode, you can even upload that and put your keywords in the file name, in the alt text. There are lots of different ways that you can get found for that episode and that specific page of show notes. You also want to make your show notes something that people who are thinking about whether or not they want to listen to the episode can make that decision, and those who have already listened to the episode can get more information and go deeper. So things that you could include here could be an episode description to summarize what's included in the episode. Maybe you want to have some pull quotes from the guest or from something that you said in there. Some key points with timestamps or chapters, any links that you mentioned while you were talking during the podcast, any lead magnets that you want to share with people so that way they can get onto your email list. And if it's an interview, you want to include that guest bio, their images, their social media links, anything that can help people navigate what to do next after they've listened to that conversation. I also recommend on your show notes page to embed the audio of that particular podcast. I know most people tend to listen to podcasts on the go, but some people, when they discover a new podcast, they want to listen to part of it right there in the browser. And this is actually pretty good for your site metrics because people are spending a long time on that page. So if they're coming from Google and they're spending 20 minutes listening to a podcast, and those people have Google Analytics installed on the site, that's a good indicator to Google that people found what they wanted when they got to that page. If you do have embedded audio there, I would also include links to subscribe to the podcast right underneath that, so that way, even if people are listening live on the site, maybe they're going to add it to their podcast queue in whatever player they use on the go. I do also recommend that you include a transcript in your show notes. I'm going to do a whole other video about why it's important, how to get it done, and how to structure it so that way it doesn't take over the whole page. Now, show notes are not Google's ideal way to deliver information. They're important for navigation for people who are already listening, but they're not actually the easiest way to consume information. So Google prefers to share things that are a more structured format like blog posts. But I know that podcasters are really busy. You don't have time to line up the interviews, record the podcast, edit the podcast, promote the podcast, and then write a whole nother blog post. That's a big ask when it comes to the amount of production that you're putting into every episode. So what I recommend to do instead is to break your podcast into content buckets. And when you have a, critical mass of a certain number of podcasts that you've done on a specific topic, maybe then you want to create a cornerstone guide where you link through to specific episodes and create sort of a thread of a narrative that runs between those podcast show notes so that people can find a blog post about that topic and then use the podcast to learn more. I'm going to include a blog post that I wrote about turning podcasts into cornerstone guides right below this because I know it's kind of a confusing topic, and I have some examples right there in that post. And then finally, a question that I get from a lot of podcasters is, should I also put my podcast onto YouTube? And the answer is It depends. If you already have an existing YouTube channel with these shorter form videos like mine, and people are really engaged with the shorter content, and then you start bringing in longer form content that doesn't have the images that go with it, you might see a drop off in the traffic to your shorter, more edited videos if you choose to mix them in with these longer audio only options. So if you already have an existing YouTube strategy, at this time, I do not recommend adding a podcast feed to your YouTube channel. On the other hand, if you aren't utilizing YouTube and you know that your audience is on YouTube, you could absolutely turn your podcast into something that people could watch on YouTube. And if it's a longer form podcast, you could get a pretty good watch time from people who are even just listening to the podcast through YouTube, almost like it's a whole nother player for your podcast. So if you know your people are on YouTube and you don't already have a presence there, you could absolutely utilize YouTube to try to get more followers and potentially become monetized and make some money from YouTube. But if you already have a YouTube strategy and you're thinking of adding just the audio component of your podcast, I would generally advise against that. If you like this video, make sure to like, and if you want more advice about how to grow your podcast using SEO, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll be sure to add more over the next couple weeks. If you have any specific questions about podcast SEO, add them to the comments below, and I may make new videos just for answering your questions. And I'll be back next week with more content marketing and SEO tips. See you then.